They'll never tell you this. The anger you feel toward others isn't about them, it's about you. It's hard to hear, I know. But Carl Jung once said that what bothers us most on the outside is what we hide most within. And here's the shock. No one irritates you, no one steals your peace. What happens is that your own shadow is poked, and the wounded ego reacts as if it were an attack. Real spirituality isn't learning to be zen by feigning calm, but facing this brutal mirror, and from there, choosing conscious responses. Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to have a secret button that triggers your fury? The colleague who talks too much, the partner who criticizes you, the stranger who cuts you off in traffic. They all touch on points your ego tries to hide from you. The persona smiles, but inside there's a volcano. What almost no one knows is that there's a space between stimulus and response. And it's in this space that the power to never again let yourself be dominated by anyone resides. Now, here's the counterintuitive statement. It's not by controlling others that you become free, but by mastering yourself. And when you discover Jung's psychological protocol, shadow integration, projection reversal, emotional alchemy, something changes forever. You stop being hostage to automatic reactions and become master of your own energy. The result? Never again will you feel like someone has the power to drive you crazy. Jung realized early in his career that the ego was not the absolute master of the psyche, but merely a manager of illusions. This was his first disturbing discovery. Behind the persona we present to the world lurked a dark dimension, filled with repressed content, unacknowledged desires, and stifled emotions. He called this territory the shadow, and it was this concept that profoundly shook the spirituality of the time, which still idealized the human being as essentially luminous. Imagine the impact of this. Instead of saying that we are good by nature, Jung asserted that we carry within us everything we judge in others. The discomfort of this revelation still resonates, because no one likes to admit that their own shadow carries as much weight as the light. To understand Jung's point, think about simple, everyday situations. Have you ever been irritated by someone who talks too much, but then realized that on certain occasions you're also verbose? Or felt anger toward people who seem to always want attention, but deep down, they long for recognition too? These small tensions are expressions of what Jung identified. What we criticize outside of ourselves is often a reflection of internal parts that the ego refuses to acknowledge. This seemingly simple discovery has a devastating impact, because it dismantles the idea that projecting a virtuous persona is enough to be pure. Psychic life is much more complex. Even more disturbing is how this dynamic influences human relationships. Carl Jung showed that our interactions are living laboratories of spirituality and shadow work. The neighbor who bothers us, the co-worker who drives us crazy, the family member who insists on repeating irritating behaviors, they all function as mirrors of archetypes we don't integrate. It's as if the unconscious uses these people as projection screens to teach us what we need to see. Denying this is living hostage to anger. Recognizing it, on the other hand, opens space for individuation. And it is precisely at this point that the most fascinating question arises: how to transform this disturbing discovery into practical life. Jung didn't just want to theorize, he saw psychology as a tool for spiritual transformation, and he soon encountered clinical cases that illustrated in an almost cinematic way the power of this shadow. One of them, which occurred in 1919, would become emblematic and open up an entire field of investigation into how our projections shape reality. In 1919, Jung reported a case that perfectly illustrates the weight of the shadow and how it infiltrates everyday life. Heinrich, a seemingly ordinary young man, carried an exemplary persona: polite, upright, hardworking. But behind this mask lay a stifled ego, torn between the desire to be accepted and the repressed rage of never being able to express his authenticity. Heinrich lived in constant conflict, and this manifested itself in outbursts of irritation toward those close to him, disproportionate attacks, with no apparent explanation. Jung realized that this was not a case of bad humor, but direct projections of the shadow that Heinrich refused to see. This case was disturbing because it showed that spirituality is not a straight line of evolution, but an internal battlefield. Heinrich saw himself as a victim of circumstances, convinced that the world provoked him. However, Jung identified that the behaviors that most bothered him in others were precisely traits he tried to stifle in himself. He hated arrogance, but harbored unrecognized arrogant impulses. He hated laziness, but his own soul longed for rest. What the world showed him was, in fact, a mirror of his unconscious. This case became a landmark for Jung because it demonstrated in a practical way what we now call shadow work. It's interesting to consider how this same pattern manifests itself in us. Who hasn't blamed a partner, a boss, a friend, for something that, deep down, reflected an internal wound? For example, someone who is deeply irritated by controlling people may be denying their own need for control. Heinrich's case reminds us that our most intense reactions are valuable clues to understanding the unconscious. Jung said that what we don't consciously do returns as fate, and Heinrich experienced exactly that. His destiny was repeatedly shaped by what he refused to accept within himself. And what's most fascinating is that, while following this case, Jung began to formulate an idea that would become central to his psychology: the notion that we all carry a shadow mirror, a psychic mechanism that causes us to project onto others what we don't want to admit in ourselves. And this effect, which seemed merely a metaphor, came to be seen by Jung as one of the keys to individuation. Jung realized that there was no coincidence in the things that most bother us about others. What we call unnecessary irritation isn't gratuitous. It's a reflection. He gave this phenomenon what we might now call the shadow mirror effect. In other words, when someone awakens a disproportionate emotion in us, it's because that person is unintentionally revealing a part of ourselves that the ego refuses to accept. The persona, with its mask of virtue, tries to keep everything under control, but the unconscious finds creative ways to reveal what has been repressed. Spirituality, in this sense, is not only the search for light, but also the courage to look into this uncomfortable mirror. This mirror works anywhere, anytime. Imagine being in a meeting and feeling overcome with anger because someone is monopolizing the conversation. Ask yourself, why does this bother me so much? Perhaps it's because you're repressing your desire to be heard. Or think about the discomfort you feel around people who are overly confident. Often, the discomfort stems from not allowing yourself to embrace your own worth. Of course, not all criticism of others is projection, but according to Jung, it's always worth investigating when the emotion is too intense. The ego loves to point the finger, but shadow work begins when you realize 3 fingers are pointing at you. A practical example is keeping a mirror journal. Every time someone provokes an outsized reaction, record what happened and reflect, in what part of my life am I also like that, or would I like to be like that? This simple practice can reveal forgotten archetypes, such as the rebel, the creator, or the warrior, who remain trapped in the shadows for fear of social judgment. By bringing these figures into awareness, you begin to break the illusion that the problem is always external. It's an exercise in brutal honesty, but profoundly transformative. This shadow mirror effect was so revealing that Jung began developing ways to guide his patients to face it head-on. He understood that it wasn't enough to simply identify the projection. It was necessary to integrate what the mirror revealed, and thus was born one of the most powerful steps in his approach: the shadow integration protocol. which allowed the individual to transform discomfort into a tool for self-knowledge. Jung knew that seeing the shadow wasn't enough. It needed to be integrated. If the mirror merely reveals, the integration protocol is what transforms. He didn't talk about eliminating the shadow, because that would be denying human nature itself. The goal was to embrace these contents, understand their role, and redirect their energy. For him, mature spirituality isn't about escaping from the shadow, but reconciling with it. Integration means accepting, yes, I have anger, envy, a desire for power, and all of this can be used constructively instead of controlling me in the unconscious. In practice, Jung proposed exercises for dialogue with the shadow, which can still be practiced today. One of them was active imagination, closing your eyes and giving voice to the inner parts that scare you most. If anger could speak, what would it say? If envy had a body, how would it move? This technique may seem strange, but it allows you to remove these forces from the psychic basement and bring them to the light of consciousness. The ego initially resists. After all, its function is to keep the persona intact. But little by little it realizes that integration liberates more than it threatens. Another important point is to transform this content into practical action. For example, repressed anger can be channeled into impact sports, such as boxing or running, helping to release physical and emotional energy. Envy can be used as a compass to discover what we truly want to achieve, rather than simply criticizing those who already have it. Even fear, when integrated, transforms into healthy prudence. Shadow work is not a punishment, but a manual for psychic reuse. The energy that once destroyed us begins to rebuild us. This protocol is so powerful because it creates a space between impulse and reaction. Instead of being overwhelmed by emotional outbursts, the individual learns to observe, dialogue, and choose. And it is precisely this gap in awareness, this space between stimulus and response, that paves the way for true psychological freedom. Jung observed that most people react automatically, as if they were puppets of their own unconscious. A sidelong glance, a misplaced word, and presto, the ego takes the wheel, defending the persona with aggression or passive silence. But between stimulus and response lies a space, a microscopic interval where freedom of choice resides. This space is what Viktor Frankl, decades later, would also emphasize. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In this space lies our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Jung, in his own way, already spoke of this. Shadow work expands this space, allowing the dominant archetype to no longer dictate the reaction alone. Imagine someone being criticized in public. The immediate impulse might be to retaliate or to withdraw into resentment. But if the person takes a deep breath, observes the emotion, recognizes the wounded shadow, and only then decides to respond, this space becomes a living alchemy. It is in this moment that practical spirituality occurs, transforming the automatic into the conscious. Small gestures, like counting to 10, taking a sip of water, or even smiling slightly, can be keys to opening this gap. The point is not to feign calm, but to buy time to choose instead of simply reacting. This space can be cultivated like a muscle. Meditation, mindfulness practices, and even physical exercise help expand it. A simple example. Before responding to an angry message, close your eyes for a few seconds and ask yourself, who's speaking now, my ego or myself? This type of question shifts awareness, interrupts impulsivity, and creates space for an aligned response. It's like installing an internal filter that prevents the shadow from exploding without reflection. And the more one practices this space, the more one realizes that it is not empty, but a territory of power. It is there that one can build their fortress of boundaries, choosing not to react as a victim, but to position themselves clearly. This silent field is the cradle of psychic dignity and the starting point for building what Jung would call inner fortitude. Jung knew that the ego, when fragile, becomes entangled with any external energy. Just one criticism and it crumbles. Just one rejection and one feels invalid. Therefore, he argued that the process of individuation involves building an internal fortress made of clear boundaries. This fortress is not an isolating wall, but a psychic architecture that protects the self from unnecessary emotional invasions. It is the ability to say, "This is mine and this is yours," without guilt. Authentic spirituality is not about dissolving oneself into another, but about learning to remain whole even amid external pressures. In practice, limits are expressed in very concrete ways. One example, refusing to answer work calls after hours without feeling indebted, or even refusing to accept abusive conversations even if they come from family members. These seemingly trivial gestures are building blocks of this invisible fortress. The ego may whisper, "They'll find you cold," but the soul responds, "My dignity is worth more." This daily exercise strengthens the persona, not as a mask of submission, but as a spokesperson for an inner truth. The fascinating thing is that, by building this fortress, psychic energy is no longer wasted on useless defenses. How many times have you caught yourself over-justifying yourself, trying to convince someone of something that shouldn't even be discussed? This dispersion drains vitality. But when the limit is clear, there's no need for endless explanations. A firm sentence spoken calmly is enough. Silence is often the most unshakable wall. Carl Jung said that true strength doesn't shout, it holds its own. And when establishing boundaries, a curious phenomenon inevitably occurs. The shadow mirrors begin to reverse. What once bothered the other no longer hurts because there is now internal protection. Projection loses strength when it encounters solid walls. And it is precisely at this point that Jung introduces one of the most transformative practices, the reversal of projection, where the individual learns to take what they previously placed on the other and transform it into self-knowledge. Few of Jung's discoveries are as challenging as the reversal of projection. He said that everything that disturbs us most in others is, to some extent, a reflection of ourselves. But instead of stopping at this uncomfortable mirror, he proposed a bold move, collecting the projected energy and asking, "What does this reveal about me?" This reversal seems simple, but it requires brutal honesty. The ego hates to admit that what it criticizes outwardly may be rooted within itself. Yet this practice is one of the most powerful keys to shadow work. An example, someone is deeply irritated by arrogant people. By reversing the projection, they realize that arrogance also resides within them, just repressed. Perhaps this person learned from an early age to hide any sign of confidence to avoid rejection. The result, every time they see someone confident, they feel angry. But by reversing the projection, they discover that what bothers them is actually a call to reclaim their own voice. This is the key point. The shadow is not garbage to be eliminated, but vital energy that demands integration. In practical life, reversing projection can be cultivated as a daily exercise. Whenever you feel a strong irritation, write down, "What exactly bothered me?" Then ask, "How does this behavior also exist in me, even if on a smaller or hidden scale?" This simple reflection can transform conflicts into mirrors of growth. Instead of wasting energy trying to change others, the person turns inward and discovers where they need to work. It's like collecting the arrows they've fired and transforming them into tools for their own development. And the more you practice this reversal, the more you realize something magical. Emotional energy, previously wasted on judgment, begins to be transmuted. Anger becomes clarity, envy becomes inspiration, fear becomes prudence. This is where Jung approaches the language of the ancient alchemists, who spoke of turning lead into gold. In psychology, this alchemy doesn't happen in the laboratory, but within the psyche, and paves the way for what we might call emotional alchemy. Jung was always fascinated by alchemy, not only as an ancient science, but as a living metaphor for what happens within the psyche. For him, transforming emotions was a process akin to converting lead into gold. Lead, heavy and dense, represented raw emotional states: anger, envy, resentment, fear. Gold symbolized the result of integration: clarity, inspiration, courage, wisdom. This emotional alchemy wasn't magic, but the fruit of awareness. When someone accepts to look at their own shadow without denying it, they automatically begin this process of transmutation. In practice, this alchemy can be felt in everyday moments. Imagine someone overcome with rage after an argument. Instead of exploding or repressing, the person takes a deep breath, writes their feelings in a journal, and then seeks to understand where this fury comes from. They discover that the anger wasn't just directed at the other person, but an internal plea for respect. In that instant, the lead of the explosion transforms into the gold of a clear boundary. This is applied spirituality, not running away from conflict, but transforming emotion into learning and conscious action. Simple tools help in this process. Guided meditation, therapeutic writing, and body practices like yoga or martial arts are all forms of inner laboratories for alchemy. Even art, whether painting or music, functions as a psychic crucible where dense contents are melted and reshaped. Jung even recommended the use of mandalas, which he considered symbolic representations of the self, to help the unconscious organize itself during these transformations. Each creative gesture is, in a way, a small alchemical work. And the more this alchemy occurs, the more the individual discovers that they don't have to choose between being tough or vulnerable. A new archetype emerges, capable of uniting firmness and compassion, strength and tenderness. An archetype that Jung saw as essential for dealing with the world without losing one's soul. The compassionate warrior, one who fights without hatred and loves without self-denial. Among the many archetypes described by Jung, few are as relevant today as the compassionate warrior. He is neither the romantic hero seeking glory, nor the martyr who sacrifices himself to be accepted. He is the one who has learned, through shadow work, to use the energy of anger without being dominated by it, to maintain boundaries without needing hatred, to practice spirituality without escaping reality. The ego, when not integrated, confuses strength with violence and compassion with weakness. But in this archetype, strength is balanced with tenderness, and compassion does not negate dignity. It is the self finding a way to act in the world. In real life, this warrior manifests itself in simple yet powerful situations. It's the mother who protects her child from injustice without becoming bitter. It's the leader who rights wrongs without humiliating. It's the person who ends an abusive relationship without seeking revenge. The compassionate warrior doesn't need to crush others to assert themselves. They know that true victory lies in keeping the soul intact. Carl Jung would say that this balance is a sign of individuation, when the persona is no longer just a social mask, but an authentic expression of what has become conscious. And this archetype can be cultivated practically. Martial arts exercises, for example, are a living metaphor for this. Learning to strike firmly, but also to restrain oneself, respecting the opponent. Readings like Dan Millman's The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, or even Jung's writings on heroic symbols, help expand this vision. Practicing conscious compassion, like listening without interrupting or helping without expecting anything in return, are daily trainings for this warrior. It's a silent discipline, not a spectacle. By embodying this archetype, the individual discovers that life is not about eliminating the shadow, but dancing with it. The compassionate warrior does not shy away from the fight, but neither does he cling to the desire to win at any cost. And it is at this point in the journey that Jung, looking at his own experiences and studies, came to a surprising conclusion about what it truly means to be unfazed by others. A conclusion that, even today, serves as a guide for those seeking to live with integrity and serenity. Upon reaching the end of his intellectual and spiritual journey, Jung realized something that many still resist accepting. No one irritates us, no one offends us, no one throws us off balance without our consent. What truly disturbs us is not the other person per se, but the blind spot within us that the other can touch. Therefore, he said that the real work is not trying to control the world, but learning to relate to one's own shadow. Spirituality, for him, was not about withdrawing from life's tensions, but about consciously immersing oneself in them. The ego reacts, the persona disguises itself, but the self observes silently, ready to guide the process of individuation. Jung concluded that inner freedom arises from this marriage of strength and self-knowledge. Those who understand the shadow are no longer as frightened by the flaws of others, because they recognize that we all carry the same pieces on the board of our psyche. The arrogant neighbor, the controlling boss, the insecure partner. They are all living archetypes, acting as involuntary teachers. Instead of seeing enemies, we can see mirrors. Instead of falling into the trap of projection, we can gather our energy and transform it. This is the true secret of not letting ourselves be shaken, not because the world has changed, but because our inner fortitude has been built. This doesn't mean Jung advocated a cold or indifferent life. On the contrary, he believed that integrating the shadow made us more human, more compassionate, and more whole. When anger no longer dominates, it can be converted into courage. When envy no longer hurts, it can become inspiration. When fear no longer paralyzes, it can become prudence. This emotional alchemy was, for Jung, the basis of psychic maturity. There is no true spirituality without traversing this inner laboratory, and ultimately, his conclusion can be summed up in a phrase that resonates to this day. What you resist persists. What you accept transforms. This is the key that opens the door to living without being dominated by anyone. Because ultimately, the freedom we seek outside can only be achieved within. So tell me, how long will you surrender your peace to others? How long will you let other people's dirty looks, misplaced words, or actions define your inner state? Carl Jung showed us that it's not others who control you, but the blind spot of your own shadow, which hasn't yet been integrated. And the question that echoes now is, will you remain hostage to this? Or will you embrace the power to transform every provocation into a laboratory of self-knowledge? If someone bothers you, that's your entry code to shadow work. If someone arouses anger, envy, or fear, that's your map to individuation. And the curious thing is that when you begin to reverse your projections and build the fortress of your limits, you discover something unthinkable. Nothing, absolutely nothing from the outside has power over you. The ego may even try to react, the persona may try to disguise it, but the self remains there, steadfast, waiting for you to choose freedom over repetition. Now it's your turn. Write in the comments what situation or person most irritates you today. What does this mirror reveal about you? What hidden archetypes are asking for integration? Don't shy away from this reflection. It holds the key to your growth. And if this video opened a space within you, don't let that flame die. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey, because here, each encounter is another step toward the psychological freedom Jung dreamed of.